All right. So, hi everyone. My name's Sam. I'm a senior at Kentucky Country Day, and today, me and a few other members from the youth board will be interviewing Mr. Racine. Real quick before we get started, can everyone just say your name and like school? Um, Emmeline. Well, I just said your name, but can we start with you, please?
My name's Emmeline. I am a junior at South High School.
My name's Julia, and I'm a senior at DuPont Manual High School.
My name's Tala, and I'm a sophomore at Kentucky Country Day School.
And then Mr. Racine, if you want, you can introduce yourself too.
Hey, I am James Racine and an educator currently at Kentucky Country Day School.
All right, so thank you all. We're gonna get started. Myself, Emmeline, Tala, and Julia will take turns asking questions to Mr. Racine. This interview is gonna mostly be about race and identity and maybe some current events here and there. So I'm gonna get started with our first question. And all right, so my first question is for Mr. Racine is how with so many different things going on this year, um, how have you been promoting racial justice yourself? Like what have you been doing to help the racial justice issue, and how have you been like educating others?
Absolutely. 2020 has been a challenging year, as you just mentioned. And kind of like my title is, using 2020 to mobilize and not paralyze, right? And so we use all of these different challenges that we're facing to make sure that we're using that to move forward, right? And the work that I do, Sam, and others here, is getting people going from that fear zone, right? Where we avoid these hard questions, right? Where we deny that there's a problem when we're talking about race in America, right? Pushing folks into that learning zone part that, where you understand your own privilege and ignoring racism, helping folks seek out questions that make ourselves uncomfortable, right? To get this courageous conversation going, right? And then that allows us to push folks into that growth zone, right? Where you sit with your discomfort, where you're promoting and advocating, right? For policies and leaders that are anti-racist, right? That kind of thing. You speak out when you see racism in action, when you see that there's so many disparities, right? There's so many inequalities, right? And this is where we really, when we're in that growth zone, we know that our mistakes won't deter us from being better, right? And so that's kind of, that embodies kind of the work that I do, especially in 2020 with everything that's going on.
Thank you.
So the next question we have for you is, what are some things that people who don't have the resources to help fund anti-racism movements can help do and to participate in those movements and still move it forward?
Absolutely. Great question. And, as you said, not everyone's going to have funds to put on, amazing events or donate to certain organizations that are doing things or even starting an organization, right? But you have to know your lane and what lane you can stay in and make some things happen. First you have to go through, I always say this kind of vigilant self-awareness, right? To really understand where you stand in all this and where your identity, how that plays a role in everything that we do. But, getting yourself in a position where you can facilitate conversations. We have so many free resources such as Zoom, right? Such as Google Meet, such as online platforms, social media, right? There's so many things you can do to change the narrative, right? To educate people. And that's what we have to do, right? To change that narrative is the education piece. A lot of people, when they speak against social justice is many times is misinformation, right? Not really understanding the purpose and the goal of what we're trying to do. And so having that education, and you can put it, I mean, in the form of, I mean, I put it as simple as memes on Instagram, right? Where you can educate your community, whether that's your immediate community, if you're a student, your school community, whether that's your friend group, your network. I mean, you know the impact that one can have, just with social media. So I think that's a huge tool that is not used enough to educate people on all these issues of social justice, and that's free.
So you spoke to us earlier about like how you have been educating people this year on anti-racism, but how do you think schools can do a better job with that sort of education?
Right. I think schools first have to recognize it, face the truth, whether we're just talking about as a country, but many as an institution, right? To look inwards and look at, okay, where have we missed the mark in our own institution, in our own organizations? And when you face that and you have those courageous conversations, you really look, right? Not in a way to make yourself feel bad, but in a way to be vulnerable, and to be able to do better, right? What did we do that was not right? And that's when you recognize that, you know how you can make change. And so schools need to do a better job at really self-assessing their own organization internally, right? So back to individually, right? When we're talking about that vigilant self-awareness, institutions have to do that for themselves as well, right? And so when we're talking about schools, we're talking about curriculum, right? Have you really looked at your curriculum and look at to see, hey, from what lens are we teaching everything? What lens are we teaching history? When we're looking at our literature that we cover in English, our English programs from first grade to 12th grade, right? What are our students coming out of? Do they really have an authentic perspective on race in America, on race relations in America, right? And so you have to look at all of that internally and make those changes, right? And so that you can push for this movement. And again, back to education, you hear me mention that a lot. But you still have some schools who are teaching young folks that slaves were happy, right? Or they were workers, right? And that's not the truth, right? So when you do that, you're teaching folks to grow up not having empathy for Black people in America, right? Because from their perspective, they didn't have it that bad, right? Or even where you hear slaves were immigrants, right? I've even heard that. And so you really got to, as a school, you got to do that internal assessment, right? So whoever's in charge of curriculum, whoever's in charge of literature, to really, dive in and do that work, to make your institution better.
So you spoke a lot about the individual, and there's a lot of terms that have been floating around now with social media and people trying to educate themselves. One that I've seen come up a lot has been implicit bias. So how would you define implicit bias, and how do we become more aware of our own biases and act on that?
Absolutely. So implicit bias, first of all, no one wants to be labeled as someone who did something wrong or said something wrong, right? So this idea of implicit bias that we all have, right, including myself, it's tough to accept, right? And so in our brain, we have to really look at our mind, right? How, you heard me mention this, it's taking in over 40 million bits of information per minute, but it's only aware of maybe like 20, right? And so it's having to take mental shortcuts, and those shortcuts kind of are based on stereotypes because we're exposed to those, whether you like it, through the books that we read, through the shows that we watch, through the jokes that we hear, through TikTok, especially now through TikTok, right? And so when your brain is taking those shortcuts and is quickly grabbing onto the stereotypes, that's how you end up saying something that has so much bias to it, right? So that's one part of it. So then that leads us to, like big time microaggressions, and, and then people get offended all the time. Okay. And so, one, you have to be aware that implicit bias is a real thing. You have to kind of check yourself. Okay, I thought that real quick when somebody said this or did this. Why did I think that? Right? Really dig deep, all the way back, right? Why do I think women are bad drivers, right? Where did I even come up with that? Why do I think all Black people are poor? Where did I come up with that, right? All kinds of things. And so then you kind of replace that. So when you see that you have certain biases towards a group of people, a lot of times that means you're not educated enough on that part of the community, right? So that means pick up a book, right? A book that is written not about people, but by a certain people, so you can learn more about their culture, learn about who they are, right? Whether that's a bias, you have a lot of biases, racially or gender-wise or religious, in a religious way, right? How much do you really know about your Jewish friends or your Muslim friends or, your LGBTQ friends? How much do you really know about them, right? Because if you don't do that, your brain, your mind is automatically always going to grab onto whatever it has at its fingertips, and those are usually stereotypes.
So, as you said in like this Zoom meeting right now, but also from a presentation you did a couple months ago for the board, you said it's really important that people read a variety of books from authors who have different races, religions, gender, ethnicity, different identities.
Hmm.
That also, so that's super important. In English, in my English class from
Hmm.
the first trimester, I was in AP English, Race and Identity, and my favorite part from
Hmm.
that class was that we got to read different pieces of literature from different types of authors.
Hmm.
So, this question's a bit more specific, but what are
Hmm.
some important pieces of literature and or films that are essential for people to read or watch to understand race and identity a bit more?
Okay. I'll tell you one right now that is especially for students, because I imagine our audience is for students, and uh, pair that with our conversation around anti-racism to really better understand that, and from a lens, racial lens. Stamped. If you're not familiar with Ibram X. Kendi, who is um, an author, there's a book that he wrote called Stamped, which is really um, a good one because it also involves current events that we're seeing, right? So it's a current book. I don't like suggesting, there's so many good pieces of literature out there, but I always love for it to be relative, right? For whatever audience we're talking about. So if you're a current student, then it's good because you have relative current events that are mentioned, for you to better understand not only our past, but what we're currently seeing, and the importance of this anti-racism movement for the future. But podcasts also, Brene Brown, if you're into podcasts, Brene Brown's podcast, the 1619 podcast is also amazing. So there's some good podcasts out there too. Eddie Glaude is another good author. Check out Eddie Glaude. Dr. Joy DeGruy, who has an amazing book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. Amazing piece of literature because it also ties our current state that we are to all the way back to slavery. So you understand the correlation there and what we need to do, but also face and unpack for us to be able to move forward, because that's another thing you hear folks say a lot of times. hey, right, slavery was so long ago, right? What's that have to do with uh, what we're doing now? And then finally, another author, a female author. That's why I brought up Dr. Joy DeGruy. She's a female author. And then Dr. Love, Bettina Love. She's amazing as well. So some good authors out there, some good podcasts out there to check out.
Thank you.
Okay, for our next question, so you talked a little bit about like pushing yourselves out of your comfort zone and into a growth
Mhm.
zone. And so once you're in that growth zone, learning how to respond to other people who make remarks in a way that's going to push them into a growth zone versus a zone where
Mhm.
they're turning away from learning. What do you
Mhm.
think are some good ways to respond specifically to instances of racism or instances like that, so you're pushing people into a growth zone versus a zone where they're disagreeing with you and don't want to talk about it?
Absolutely. And so one is you have to, um, you know, use tools to get into those courageous conversations, rather saying, hey, that was racist. Because remember, I just said a few minutes ago, nobody wants to be labeled a racist or sexist or whatever, homophobic, whatever, we're dealing with at the time of that conversation. So calling that out off top as racism, probably 9 out of 10 times would not end in a productive, courageous conversation. And so you always want to start, affirming that person, right? You probably heard me, use that being a deer, right? Affirming that person, describing exactly what they said or did, right? But then you mentioned the impacts. Okay, you said this, you did this. Here's the impact that it has on people, right? Whether the person is right there or whether you're talking about a community, right? So you really have to describe that, and then describe your filters, right? Whether that's because you've got to think about intersectionality of things, because whether we're talking about female and race or gender and race or whatever the case may be, religion and race, so many things. There's so many different variables. So really unpacking those filters, but then that's when you get yourself, also mention intention, right? You may not have intended this to be racist or whatever, right? And then that's when you get yourself to have that courageous conversation around education. But those first couple of things you got to do first, because that's where you're grabbing that person's attention. That's when you're allowing yourself to go into that productive conversation. If you don't do that first, then it becomes, one of those debates where you see all the time, unfortunately. And that's when people end up, then get to the position where they're politicizing things, where, it wasn't about politics to begin with, right? It's about humanity. It's about respect. It's about growth, as you said.
So in the last question, you mentioned something called filters. I know this has an influence on how you respond to things and how you intake information. Could you elaborate more on how filters affect us and the kind of filters we would have when we're talking to others?
Absolutely. We have, and that's why I said, at the beginning of this conversation, I said, you have to know who you are as you're navigating these spaces and communities, right? And that's why it's so important that we go through this process of identity development. For me, as many of you know, I'm a biracial person. My mother is white American. My father is Black Haitian. I grew up in Haiti, in the Caribbean. I grew up, you know, um, in a Catholic school, although I was Episcopalian and my mother was Baptist. And so there's so many different intersectionalities in identity. And then as I came to the States, a lot of the things about my identity changed and how I had to navigate spaces. And so you have to really get yourself in a position where you are aware of filters, not only for yourself, but for other people. So that person, I forget who just asked that last question, I'm sorry. As you're having that conversation, not you, the question before that, as you're having conversation with someone, you got to know what their filters are as well, right? You can't jump in and be like, hey, you got to do this, that, and the other, but you don't quite understand where they're coming from, right? What their journey looked like, what they faced, right? And so you got to be aware of that in everything that we do. I hope that answered your question.
So I think we touched on this a little bit earlier, but this is especially surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement. People who really agree with the movement and really support the cause, how can they be the best and most supportive allies?
The most supportive allies. So you got to unpack, first of all, what does an ally mean to you? And the reason why you have to ask that is sometimes you got to make sure you're not creating a situation that, as an ally, you're creating more work for the people you're supporting or protecting. Why? Because sometimes you go to that person, right? What can I do? Or what, then it's like, now they have to figure out, they have more labor, right, to on their, on in emotional labor to kind of support you becoming an ally, right? And so the best way is really to do this work in a way that supports folks without creating more work for them. And I think the best agenda item for an ally is really educating other folks for them to be able to become allies as well. And so a lot of the work is actually away from the scene. Having those courageous conversations. When you see someone say something or do something, that's where, again, affirming the relationship, whether it's someone you know or a friend, and then getting them into those conversations. And then you may be able to, have them understand. They may not become an ally, but if anything, they'll understand that the narrative that they were painting is false. Because even with Black Lives Matter, as you're mentioning, the problem, if you really pay attention to conversations around the pushback, you'll kind of realize that, wait a minute, y'all don't even really understand the whole point and idea behind Black Lives Matter, right? It's not saying that other lives don't matter. They're just saying that Black lives should matter as well, right? And so, the more you have those conversations as allies, kind of educating folks, the less pushback Black folks will get, and the more people will understand, the seriousness and the validity of it all.
Before we wrap up this interview, is there anything that you'd like to share with us and our audience that you haven't had the chance to share yet?
I think the biggest thing is this movement is to create a better tomorrow. So you all are the best folks on the ground. Folks my age, I'm not trying to show my age here, but we may not see the results that we're looking for now, but the idea is that, when you all are 45, that you're not still fighting this, right? And so I encourage you all, anyone who is in school right now, anyone who is young, this is very important for you all to continue this work, to do this work, so that you're not still doing it when you're 40 years old, right? And you have the greatest audience. You have the largest audience. Most regular anybody's following on Instagram or TikTok. You look at it and you understand, right? And so young people have this huge network, right, where you can do this education, where you can challenge people's way of thinking, where you can challenge people's perspectives, right, but also educate folks for us to have a better tomorrow, and understand that we need to do this for all identities, for all dimensions of diversity, right? So we need to do this work for race relations in America. We need to do this work for religious relations in this world. identity relations, right? Everything. Um, Instead of walking around with this illusion of inclusion, we really need to live it. Um, and that's my greatest advice, right? And so that the work is happening when you see a a Christian person standing up to defend a Muslim person, when you see a straight Black person standing up to protect a trans student, when you see a white Jewish student standing to protect the Blacks, you know what I mean? That's when we are really going to see this work really moving well. So that's the challenge that I have for young people. And keep pushing.
Thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for answering all of our questions. Um, I find you to be very inspirational, and your speeches are always very impactful. I always learn new things, and I'm sure the audience will learn from you too. So thank you once again.
Thanks for having me, you all. Such a pleasure.